The year was 1897, and in the heart of Louisiana's tangled bayou, whispers spread of a phenomenon no one could fully explain, long before the first body went missing, before entire families packed their belongings and fled the swamplands. There were the lights, soft, glowing orbs that drifted silently above the black waters at night. To some, they resembled lanterns carried by fishermen. To others, they flickered like torches suspended in the fog. But those who had followed them, hunters, trappers, men too brave for their own good, never came back. The year was 1897, and the swamps of Louisiana stretched endlessly, a maze of waterlogged cypress trees and winding channels of black water. It was a land both feared and revered, where nature seemed to possess a mind of its own. Nights there were not quiet. They throbbed with the chorus of frogs, the low hum of insects, and the occasional cry of something moving unseen through the reeds. Yet amid these familiar sounds, a new and unsettling presence emerged. It began with whispers of strange glowing lights, faint at first like the glimmer of a lantern in the distance. Fishermen claimed they saw them hovering just above the water, pale and soft in hue, drifting slowly through the fog. Unlike any flame they had known, the lights did not waver with the wind or flicker like a candle. They moved deliberately, as if they had purpose, as though they were searching. At first, the community dismissed them as tricks of the swamp. Some believed they were reflections of distant fires, perhaps from hunters camping along the edges of the marsh. Others suspected natural phenomena, swamp gas igniting in the humid air, what some called feu follet. But those who lived closest to the water, men and women who had known the bayou their entire lives, insisted these were no accidents of light. The orbs appeared too consistently, too deliberately, sometimes returning to the same places night after night. Families who rowed their small boats under the moonlight told of lights trailing them silently, always just beyond reach, glowing softly in the mist before slipping away into the reeds. Children who peeked through the cracks of their cabin shutters claimed they saw them floating outside, as if watching. The lights varied in color, some a faint bluish white, others a warmer yellow, and on rare occasions, a deep and unsettling red. They seemed to come alive most strongly after heavy rains, when the swamp air hung thick and the fog crept low over the water. Men returning late from the traps described how the lights would appear without warning. First one, then two, then several, drifting above the channels in near-perfect silence. Unlike lanterns, there were no shadows cast from them, no evidence of a wick or flame. They glowed with a cold, steady brilliance that unsettled those who saw them. Witnesses often described a sensation that was more than sight. The light seemed to stir something within, a tugging at the edge of thought as if beckoning. Hunters swore that they lost all sense of direction when the orbs appeared, their knowledge of the swamp's pathways dissolving as the lights lured them deeper into the waterlogged forest. Those who resisted the pull spoke of unease and instinctive dread, as though the lights carried not warmth but warning. Some turned their boats and fled, rowing with desperate urgency until the glow faded behind them. Others admitted they were unable to look away, transfixed by the strange orbs until they vanished without trace. Soon the lights became more than a curiosity. They became a fear whispered about in churchyards, spoken of in lowered voices at trading posts, and etched into the wary silence of those who lived along the bayou's edge. They were no longer dismissed as harmless illusions. They were seen as signs, as harbingers of something darker, something that could not yet be named. Long before the disappearances began, the swamp people of Louisiana carried with them a deep well of folklore, passed from one generation to the next in whispers and half-told tales. The strange lights that appeared above the bayou in 1897 did not arrive into a vacuum of belief. They were immediately woven into the fabric of superstition that already defined life in the marshlands. For the Creole families who had settled there, the swamp was never just a landscape, it was alive, breathing and filled with spirits that demanded both respect and fear. When the first reports of glowing orbs spread through the parish, the elders recalled stories their grandmothers had told, of wandering souls that roamed the marshes, unable to find rest. Some said the lights were the spirits of those who had drowned in the bayou's black waters, forever condemned to wander. Others believed they were omens, warning signs sent before calamity struck, a spectral lantern leading men not to safety, but to their doom. Around fire pits and churchyards, darker tales emerged. The lights, many whispered, were not natural at all but conjured by swamp witches, women known in secret as les dames du marais. These witches were said to practice rites in the deepest reaches of the cypress groves, far beyond where daylight could reach. To see a light meant one had strayed too close to their territory, and the glow was not a mere flicker but a lure, a trap meant to draw the living into the witch's grasp. Parents would hush their children when the subject arose, but the warnings were clear. To follow a light was to surrender your soul. There were also tales rooted in old French and African folklore, retold and reshaped by generations. Some linked the lights to the feu follet, mischievous spirits known to toy with travelers, leading them astray into bogs and quicksand until they sank beneath the muck. Unlike benign guardian angels, the feu follet thrived on mischief, delighting in confusion and often malice. Those who claimed to have seen the lights insisted there was intelligence behind their movements, a slow, taunting drift that gave just enough hope of reaching them before slipping farther into the swamp's labyrinth. The local priests tried to temper these fears, reminding their congregations that the swamp was filled with natural mysteries, swamp gas, reflections, tricks of the night air. Yet even the most devout found themselves unsettled, for the tales did not fade with sermons. Instead, they grew. Passed through Cajun songs and hushed nighttime prayers, hunters began to carry charms carved from cypress wood, blessed by elders to ward off malevolent forces. Some families marked their doors with chalk crosses, believing the signs would protect their homes from the spirits of the marsh. Women hung bottles filled with blue liquid near their windows, a tradition rooted in the belief that evil spirits could be trapped within the glass. As the sightings became more frequent, the folklore intensified. Stories spread of men who followed the lights only to vanish, leaving behind boats adrift and nets full of rotting fish. Children were told not to linger at dusk, for the lights preyed on innocence and curiosity. What began as superstition became survival wisdom, ingrained into the rhythm of daily life. To the people of the Bayou, the lights were not a mystery to be studied, but a danger to be avoided, manifestations of powers far older and darker than science could explain. The first disappearances along the bayou did not at once cause panic. Life in the swamps was harsh, and men often vanished into its endless channels, claimed by sudden storms, gators, or the mire itself. But when Elias Broussard failed to return from his traps in the spring of 1897, the unease began. Elias was no careless youth. He was a seasoned trapper, respected for his knowledge of the swamp's hidden currents and its treacherous ground. His small skiff was found drifting near the reeds, still laden with supplies, the oars resting neatly along its sides. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned basket or claw marks on the wood. Inside a damp satchel lay his journal, its final entries smeared by swamp water, the last word scrawled in a hurried hand. The light moves closer each night. To those who read it, the message was not the rambling of a man lost to drink or madness. It was a warning. Weeks later, two brothers, Etienne and Marcel Fontenot, disappeared while hunting for muskrat. Their mother insisted they had gone no farther than a mile from their homestead. Searchers found their boot prints pressed into the mud, following the narrow trail of reeds before halting abruptly on solid ground. It was as if the brothers had simply stepped out of existence. Their rifles, their gear, even their dogs were never recovered. The family clung to hope, lighting candles in the small church every night, but the bayou remained silent. In the absence of bodies, rumors filled the void. Some whispered that the brothers had followed the lights deeper into the swamp. Others believed they had been taken, not by water or beast, but by something that walked unseen in the reeds. By midsummer, disappearances were no longer rare anomalies. A fisherman named Antoine Leblanc failed to return after setting out for his nightly catch. His boat was later discovered wedged against the roots of a cypress tree, empty but for his lantern still unlit. Entire households began to dread the nights when the fog settled thick, for it was during these evenings that men failed to return home. The disappearances carried no pattern of age or skill. Old trappers vanished just as swiftly as young hunters, as though the swamp cared nothing for experience. The growing tally spread fear through the bayou community. Some families began to lock their doors as if wood and iron could keep away whatever stalked the night. Others abandoned their cabins altogether, fleeing to relatives in higher towns where the waters did not creep at their doorsteps. Children were kept indoors after sunset, their laughter replaced by silence. Each new disappearance only deepened the dread, for nothing was ever found. Not clothing, not bones, not even the carcass of a dog. The swamp seemed to swallow them whole. In the parish records, the official causes varied: accidents, drownings, wild animals. But among neighbors, the truth was whispered in darker tones. Elias, the Fontenot brothers, LeBlanc, each one had been seen or heard speaking of strange lights in the nights before they vanished. And to those who remained, the connection was undeniable. As the summer of 1897 wore on, the air in the bayou thickened not only with heat and humidity, but with a palpable fear that settled over every household. Once, the nights had been filled with laughter spilling from porches, with fiddles echoing across the water and children chasing fireflies along the edge of the reeds. Now the swamp grew quiet after dusk. Doors were bolted early, shutters drawn tight, and oil lamps burned long into the night as families huddled inside. The vanishings were no longer isolated tragedies whispered about at church. They had become a collective terror. Each week seemed to bring a new absence. A fisherman gone from his boat, a hunter who never returned from the trails, or a lone traveler whose horse came back riderless, its saddle slick with swamp water. The fear seeped into daily life, turning the once lively marshland into a place of suspicion and dread. Stories began to spread of strange disturbances outside cabins. Women reported hearing footsteps crunching through the reeds late at night, the sound deliberate, heavy, as though a man was pacing just beyond the light of the lantern. Yet when husbands rushed out with rifles in hand, there was nothing but still water and whispering cypress leaves. Some claimed to hear knocking at their doors in the small hours. 3 steady raps that sent shivers through the spine. When the door was opened, no visitor stood waiting. Others swore they heard voices across the water, low and hushed, carrying words they could not quite understand. It was not the familiar sound of neighbors calling from a distance, but something older, something that seemed to rise from the swamp itself. Children began waking from nightmares, insisting they had seen faces staring at them through the cracks in the shutters. Some described eyes glowing faintly in the dark like embers suspended in the fog. Parents tried to dismiss it as imagination, but the growing unease in their own hearts made the denial hollow. Dogs refused to leave their porches, whining low when the lights appeared in the distance. Chickens refused to roost on certain nights as if stirred by some instinctive fear. The community, once bound tightly together by faith and survival, began to fray. Families accused one another of hiding the truth, of dabbling in witchcraft, of bringing down a curse upon them all. At gatherings, voices rose with arguments over whether the disappearances were caused by men, bandits or killers using the swamp as cover, or by something beyond human understanding. The older folk, steeped in generations of bayou lore, leaned heavily into the latter. They spoke of restless spirits, of witches, of the feu follet luring souls into the dark. The younger and more practical tried to cling to explanations of wild beasts or accidents, though even they admitted the sheer number of vanishings defied logic. The fear became so pervasive that even ordinary sounds, a snapping branch, a splash in the water, took on sinister meaning. What had once been background noise now carried weight. Each creak of the cabin floor or rustle of reeds pressing down on nerves already frayed to breaking. The bayou itself seemed to turn against its people, and every night, with each lantern extinguished, the community braced for the possibility that someone else would be gone by morning. Amid the terror that settled over the swamps, stories began to emerge from those who claimed to have come face to face with the lights and survived. These witness testimonies were not offered lightly. Many spoke in hushed voices, fearful that to share what they had seen was to invite the lights back again. Yet their accounts carried a strange consistency, a thread of detail that tied them all together and made dismissal difficult. The first came from a fisherman named Pierre Lejeune, a man known for his stubbornness and skill on the water. Pierre told of how one moonless night he had been returning home when he noticed a soft glow hovering above the water ahead. At first he thought it was another fisherman carrying a lantern, but the light did not sway as it would with a human hand, nor did it cast a reflection upon the water. Instead, it floated steadily, gliding through the fog as though it had a mind of its own. Pierre said he felt a strange pull within his chest, a compulsion to follow. He paddled after it until the swamp grew so quiet that even the insects seemed to vanish. When his lantern shattered in his boat, he realized too late that the glow was no longer ahead but directly above him. It flared suddenly, not warm but cold, and in that instant he swore it was not a flame at all but something alive, an eye watching him. He fled, abandoning his nets, and never again ventured onto the water after dark. Pierre's account was not the only one. A young trapper, Joseph Landry, described how the lights seemed to mimic his movements. He had spotted 2 orbs rising out of the reeds while checking his snares at dusk. They hovered side by side, keeping a steady pace with him as he walked. Each time he paused, they stopped. Each time he quickened his steps, they surged forward. When he finally turned to confront them, he claimed the lights separated, one circling to his left, the other to his right, until he felt surrounded. He ran blindly through the brush, tumbling into a ditch of water, and did not stop running until he collapsed at his father's cabin door. He could barely speak, his body shaking with cold and terror, but the look in his eyes silenced all doubt. Other testimonies carried the same chilling details: the sense of being watched, the unnatural silence, the sudden disorientation that left even seasoned hunters lost in familiar territory. A woman named Marie Boudreau, one of the few who dared to speak openly, claimed she saw a light hovering outside her cabin window, pressing against the glass like a lantern held aloft by invisible hands. She said it lingered for nearly an hour, pulsing faintly before vanishing into the trees. The next morning she found footprints in the mud beneath the window, though no man in the parish owned boots of that size. These accounts, though ridiculed by skeptics, were repeated often enough to take root in the collective fear of the bayou. They were not told as stories meant to entertain, but as warnings, survival lessons to those who might be tempted to chase the glow. For those who claimed to have seen the lights and lived, the memory remained like a scar, an experience that could not be forgotten and would never fully be explained. When the number of vanishings could no longer be ignored, local authorities stepped into the swamp, hoping to quiet the growing unrest. Sheriffs, deputies, and volunteers formed search parties, armed with rifles and carrying heavy torches to cut through the oppressive dark. They rode horses where the ground was firm, but most traveled by skiff, pushing through channels thick with duckweed and lily pads. For many of these men, it was their first time venturing so deeply into the marsh, and their confidence soon gave way to unease. The swamp had always been unforgiving, but now it seemed alive, heavy with silence that pressed down upon them, broken only by the occasional drip of water from a cypress branch or the distant bellow of a bullfrog. Each patrol set out determined, yet returned subdued, shaken by things they could not explain. Some reported that their torches flickered and died all at once, extinguished as though smothered by invisible hands. Others swore they had glimpsed lights in the distance, floating just beyond reach, pulling them off course until they realized they were lost. Men who had lived their lives in the parish found themselves unable to retrace their own paths, spinning in circles until dawn broke and revealed how far they had drifted from their starting point. Horses panicked for no reason, their eyes rolling white, refusing to press forward. Dogs brought along to track scents would whine and cower, tails between their legs, refusing to move into certain areas of the swamp. Despite the resources poured into these searches, nothing was ever recovered. Boats were found adrift without passengers, personal belongings scattered but intact, rifles propped against trees as if their owners had simply stepped away for a moment and never returned. There were no bodies, no blood, no evidence of gator attack or drowning. The swamp yielded nothing but silence. The reports written afterward were dry and official, citing accidents, natural dangers, or the unpredictable nature of the wilderness. But the men who had walked those waters spoke differently when no pens were scratching paper. Around taverns and in private whispers, they admitted the lights unnerved them, that the swamp itself seemed to resist their presence. Some said the fog grew thicker when the orbs appeared, swallowing whole groups in its folds until each man felt alone. Others claimed they heard voices calling their names, familiar voices of loved ones who were nowhere near the bayou. Tension built between officials and the families of the missing. Mothers demanded answers that sheriffs could not give. Fathers grew angry, accusing the authorities of cowardice or incompetence. Yet the reality was simpler and darker. The swamp itself gave them nothing to work with. Without bodies, without tracks, without even the comfort of closure, the disappearances remained open wounds. The failure of the authorities only deepened the sense of dread, confirming what many already believed. Whatever haunted the bayou was beyond the reach of law, beyond the power of man. And as the night stretched on, fewer men volunteered for the patrols. Even the bravest among them had begun to fear that if they searched too long, the swamp would take them too. By the end of 1897, the swamp had claimed more lives than anyone dared to count aloud. Families moved away in clusters, their cabins left to rot beneath the moss-draped cypress, while those who stayed behind carried the weight of unanswered questions. The disappearances had no conclusion, no bodies to bury, no graves to mark with wooden crosses. Instead, the community was left with silence and stories, fragments of testimony that blurred the line between memory and myth. The swamp, once the heart of their survival, had become a place of dread, and into that void of explanation, legends took root. Scholars who later studied the events pointed to natural phenomena. Some argued the lights were nothing more than swamp gas, methane igniting in the heavy air, a fleeting and harmless trick of chemistry mistaken for something supernatural. Others suggested reflections, lanterns carried by distant travelers, their glow distorted by fog and water. A few skeptics dismissed the entire ordeal as mass hysteria, insisting the vanishings could be explained by ordinary dangers, drowning, gators, the countless hazards of a swamp that had swallowed men long before the year 1897. Yet these explanations never satisfied those who had lived through the terror. Science could not explain why seasoned hunters vanished without leaving so much as a boot print, why boats were found fully stocked and drifting as if abandoned mid-task, or why survivors described the same chilling sensations when confronted with the lights, the silence, the disorientation, the pull to follow. Among the locals, other theories thrived. The most common held that the lights were restless spirits, the souls of the drowned, luring the living to share their fate. Families who lost loved ones often clung to this belief, imagining that their missing kin had been taken into a world beyond, caught between land and water. Others whispered darker tales of swamp witches whose spells had finally taken form, punishing the community for trespassing on sacred ground. There were even those who suggested the lights were not of this earth at all, hinting at things older and stranger than men could comprehend, forces that had lived in the marshes long before the first cabins were raised. The mystery lingered because it refused to resolve. The records stopped, the investigations ended, but the stories continued. Travelers through the region in later years spoke of abandoned homesteads, their porches sagging into the mud, doors hanging open as though the occupants had fled in haste. Children who grew up hearing the tales would point out stretches of swamp, where the water ran blacker than elsewhere, warning each other never to wander near at night. Fishermen muttered of nights when they saw faint glows hovering over the reeds, and though they rowed faster, they dared not look too closely. Even generations later, the events of 1897 cast their shadow. Descendants of those who vanished still speak cautiously of the swamp lights, reluctant to dismiss them entirely. The bayou holds its secrets close, and the people who live along its edges know better than to pretend they are safe from them. For in the deep hush of the swamp, when fog settles low and the cypress roots stretch like grasping hands, the memory of that year returns, a year when the lights appeared, and entire lives were swallowed by the silence of the marsh. What you've just heard is not merely a story, it is a wound in history, a silence that has never been answered. In 1897, the swamp lights lured families into fear and left the bayou scarred by mystery, and even today their glow lingers in the minds of those who dare to remember. But what do you believe? Were these vanishings the cruel hand of nature, or something older, darker, waiting in the reeds for the next curious soul to follow? Your voice matters here. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us what you see in these shadows. Do you hear the echo of superstition? Or do you sense something that cannot be explained away? Every perspective adds another thread to this tapestry of mystery, and together we can keep these forgotten stories alive. If this tale has unsettled you, if it has drawn you into the fog of unanswered questions, then join us for the journeys yet to come. Subscribe not as a passing visitor, but as a witness to the secrets history has left behind. Each episode will carry you deeper into the forgotten corners of time, where fact and folklore blur, and where every unanswered question beckons like a light across dark waters. So I ask you, when the night is quiet, and you see a light flicker just beyond the trees, would you dare to follow?